What we have lined up for the next hour and a bit is a panel discussion, and I'm just really grateful to be joined by four fantastic panelists. Lori Beaman, I'm trying to be alphabetical here, Maggie McMillan, Richard Rogerson, and Chris Udry. In the best tradition of economics as a profession, I plan to do 0 introductions, and they're just people who know a lot about the topic. And I thought I'd just begin by asking each of them to say a little bit in response and maybe talk a bit in light of their own research. I thought maybe I'd start with Richard. And Richard, just connecting to the last paper that was presented in this work on land rental markets, land market imperfections clearly seem as though they could be important in understanding why agriculture isn't taking off in poor countries. And we can connect those, I think, to the broader topic of misallocation, which is something you've written on. And your recent work with Federico suggests that misallocation in agriculture may play a really important role. So how do you see misallocation fitting in? It's something we haven't really talked about very directly today yet, but it's kind of implicit in several of the papers.
Sure. Well, let me start just by thanking the organizers for having put the conference together today and tomorrow. It's been a very stimulating morning. Thanks to Doug for putting the panel together. I'm eager to hear what the other panelists have to say, but I guess just in terms of the question, I mean, I think, you know, this came up in the very first presentation today, in Marcus's presentation. He presented what I think we all take as consensus. Poor countries are not very productive, but they're particularly not very productive in agriculture. And that's kind of a understanding why that is, I think, is a hugely important question for thinking about development and the development process. And then you start to drill down and say why this is, and I guess, you know, just almost anybody could list a bunch of reasons why productivity might be low. So one thing is maybe they're not adopting best practice methods. It's a little bit like you look at, even in a rich country, we know there's lots of heterogeneity of productivity within narrowly defined industries. Some firms don't seem to be as productive, and you can say, you know, why is that? And, you know, maybe they don't have a very good manager who knows how to take advantage of what's out there. Maybe the manager is just not very good in some other sense. So you can think about all those things with agriculture. And then as you said, you know, so one way to think about this is there's something at the individual producer level where they're not doing what they should be doing to maximize output. But the misallocation literature tries to point out that it could be that every individual is doing the best they can with their inputs, but maybe we've got the wrong allocation of inputs across these producers. We don't have the bad managers have too many workers, the right workers are not in the right place, and that could lead to a situation where at a more aggregated level, there's less output than there should be, but it's not because any one person is kind of not doing the best with their circumstances. And so if we talk specifically about agriculture, as you said, there's been a bunch of work on land markets. And I think, you know, there's at least suggestive evidence out there that one of the big issues in terms of potential misallocation issues with agriculture is that the better farmers should have more land. They should be, it's like good managers should have bigger firms, so good farmers should have bigger farms. And that could be an important part of the problem. So again, I think, you know, obviously, Doug, you've worked on this, your paper with Chris Udry. So there's also the paper by Raul and Diego, which kind of suggested, looking at Malawi, that there was massive misallocation of land. Again, Doug, your paper with Chris. kind of challenged that and said, you know, we shouldn't, that's actually a little bit tricky to truly put hard numbers on that. So again, I think it's a little bit of an open question, but you know, I'm going to stop there. As I say, I'm hoping that we'll just talk more generally about what the state of knowledge is, exactly about what we understand about the reasons for the low productivity.
Thanks, Richard. That's great. And let me just switch a little bit from thinking about misallocation in land to thinking about misallocation of people. And let me turn to you, Maggie, because you've done quite a bit of work on essentially on labor allocation across sectors and within sectors as well. And I guess one of the striking findings from your earlier work is that we've seen, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, we've seen labor moving from not from low productivity sectors to high, but to some degree from low productivity agriculture into low productivity services. And then in this recent work that you talked about the other day, an expansion of low productivity household enterprises in manufacturing. So what do you think is going on? And is there a problem here? And take it away.
If I knew the answer for sure, I'd be a rich woman. But superficially at least, it seems like we have, if we compare like Ethiopia and Tanzania to Taiwan and Vietnam, Vietnam is a more interesting country for comparison, and also being used as a model by countries like Ethiopia and Tanzania with the industrial parks and so forth. What you see is total employment in manufacturing in Ethiopia, total employment in manufacturing in Tanzania is rising rapidly, while formal sector employment in manufacturing in these countries is relatively flat and stagnant. But if you look at Vietnam, on the other hand, you see total manufacturing employment going up in Vietnam, formal sector employment going up in manufacturing in Vietnam, and informal sector share of employment in manufacturing falling. So we've argued in previous work that this seems to be a symptom of demand-driven structural change in at least Ethiopia and Tanzania. And the concrete examples I can give, they're related to what Nicholas Monica was talking about this morning, but it seems either rising agricultural productivity or public investment or productive savings, the productive savings net program, transfers. Some incomes are rising in rural areas, and I think we know that, and that rising incomes is leading to increased demand for things like milled flour and this sort of thing, and processed maybe beverages or whatever. But these are all non-tradable goods, so we see a rise in low productivity activities outside of the agricultural sector, and we don't see rapid growth or much growth at all, especially in employment in the formal industrial sector. And I'm using manufacturing because we have the data to disaggregate into sort of large formal firms, smaller formal firms, and household enterprises. But we see this pattern also in services and other so-called modern sectors. And so I think, part of the question is, why aren't we seeing a more rapid expansion in formal sector activities in these countries? Clearly, we need to understand a lot about what's happening outside the formal sector, and we need more and better data. But for the formal sector activities, it's not that straightforward as to why these formal sectors aren't expanding more rapidly in African countries. So, for example, bureaucracy and red tape and so on and so on. Vietnam had very poor scores on these measures prior to taking off, similar to Ethiopia and Tanzania. Wages are low in Ethiopia. Maybe they're too low, but it's a puzzle because wages are high in Tanzania, but we see the similar patterns in Ethiopia and Tanzania. Different industrialization strategies, but similar patterns of informal employment growth. And then You know, maybe, so Blattman and Durkheim, you know, have that work where they show that workers would prefer, you know, to run their own enterprises rather than stay as laborers in factory jobs. And I've done some work on Tanzania with a nationally representative survey from 2010, showing that 50% of the owners of these small, very informal, low productivity businesses, at least they report, I mean, this is self-reported information, but they report that they would prefer to stay in their business than to take a salaried, you know, job. And I think that we need to understand that. And then the thing that does worry me a little bit is that a lot of the formal sector manufacturing activity in both of these countries is highly capital intensive. So the food and beverages sector dominate both Ethiopia and Tanzania. And that, I mean, the fact that it's, Tanzania is doing extraordinarily well, exporting a lot of stuff to its neighbors, processed food products and so forth. But that kind of activity is generating no employment. This is what we find from the microdata. So that raises a lot of questions about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and what we can expect to see from that. And is this a problem? You know, I don't know. Maybe Africa will follow a different path, and maybe these small non-farm enterprises and the long informal firms are leading to enough income generation and savings that people will get better educated, and you know it will lead to a long-term development. I just don't know. And so I hope on the surface of it and in the short run it seems problematic, but I hope that it's not.
Thanks. I mean, let me just follow that, I guess, and turn to you, Lori, moving a little bit from sectoral level down to individual level in thinking about labor markets. And I guess I have in mind here, you know, lots of us working in literature on structural transformation have been looking at data in which there seem to be gaps in earnings or living standards between rural and urban locations, or between agriculture and non-agriculture. We get a little mixed up sometimes whether we're talking about sectors or locations. The micro take on this is pretty mixed, as I think was referenced earlier in Marcus's presentation. It's not so clear whether the gaps are as big. Are labor markets working well? You've done quite a lot of work on labor markets. What's your take on this?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of this literature, even though I haven't contributed to it directly. So I teach it in my PhD class, and I have to say it's the topic that I enjoy teaching the most. And I think the reason I like teaching it so much, it sort of has to do with the goal of this group, and that it's, you know, it starts off with some like macro facts, and then you have some micro data that's pulled in that originally confirms the macro facts, and then there's some micro analysis that sort of disagrees with it. And I think what I guess my initial take on your question is that I think like both the macro and the micro evidence can be true at the same time. So I guess I do believe that there's these gaps, but I also think that it seems that if we just randomly move people from one sector to the next, those gains seem to be pretty modest, right? So they're either between 0 or maybe they're like 30%. So even if we take the 30%, I mean, 30% in improvement in earnings and consumption, I think are real. Like that's like something we should be doing from a policymaker. Like I would rather have, we would all like to have 30% more income, right? But it's not the sort of like game changer, like truly transformative kind of income changes that I think when you look at those like raw gaps seem to be so alluring about structural transformation. And so even if we take that 30% as like the true like causal impact of randomly moving people, I think there's still something that in this literature that needs to be kind of thought about that gap between 30% and then what the raw differences in the agricultural gap. So like Doug, your early work on this topic, which wasn't that many years ago, but the literature is so dynamic that it's the early work. And I'll maybe circle back to that on where I think that could go in a moment. But in terms of the labor markets, I think the reality is there's frictions in every labor market, right? If you look at the U.S., there's certainly frictions. Refugees benefit from, to plug my own work, refugees benefit from social networks, and that there must be some frictions in information flows even within the U.S. And so the places that I've worked in most, India, Malawi, Mali, they all have significant frictions in the labor market, but the nature of those frictions are very different. And so in India, the restrictions, those frictions might be coming to do with things like caste. Although overall India has a much more, of the three countries, has the most sort of dynamic labor market. In Malawi, you certainly see the existence of, within the rural agricultural sector, you do see the existence of a labor market, what all development economists know like one Chichewa word, which is ganyu, which is the word for wage labor in Malawi. But it's still relatively rare and seems to be used as sort of the like income of last resort. And then I would say of my experience, the most extreme is Mali, where it's really hard to find evidence of any sort of wage labor market. I'll take advantage of this forum to talk about a pilot that Chris and I tried to do, and the pilot failed, and so like no product will ever be written about it. So I'll use this forum to then talk about it. So sort of similar to like Lorenzo is trying to create a land market. We tried to create a labor market in Mali. And so we just like went around to a bunch of villages, like, hey, does anyone want to work? Hey, does anyone want to be hired? We can provide some like subsidies to try to be like the matchmaker. And like nobody was interested in what we had to sell. And maybe somebody could do a better job, of course. But it turned out, I think that the frictions were not the ones that we anticipated. So like we had started off as like thinking like, oh, well, maybe people prefer to work for themselves because there's moral hazard and there's adverse selection. And when you hire somebody else, you don't know how hard they're going to work. You don't know if they're going to be good workers. But the friction that we ended up seeing was simply more like an intra-household problem where like the fathers didn't want to release their adult sons to work for somebody else because then they would get to keep the money, et cetera. And so I do think, and so that happens to be, I think that story is very specific. What we also saw was actually the pool of laborers that we found willing to go to the rural areas were actually urban workers, which sort of surprised me. And is not kind of how we usually think. I think about like flows going from rural to urban. But the friction that we found there was probably very Mali specific, not likely to be a general interest finding. But I think it does highlight how, the nature of these frictions are going to vary a lot. And so there could be a lot of work in this area of finding places where there's the largest frictions, might also be the places where the returns are going to be highest, but those what the nature of those frictions might be, some of those things might be policy malleable and some of them are not. Like it's really hard for us to like go in and monkey around with intra-household bargaining in Malian households in order to improve the labor frictions. Like the restrictions in the Chinese labor market are policy maker made and therefore are potentially policy maker malleable as well. And so I think there's a first step of trying to figure out, the heterogeneity in those labor market frictions and if they correlate then with these, like the returns to migration. But I think we also need to be cognizant that some of these frictions might be very hard for us as policymakers to change.
That's great. And I think the point about the frictions not necessarily being where we think they are or the ones that we think we're going to find is a really interesting one. Chris, let me come back to you, and the topic of frictions in markets and market failures and pervasive market failures in developing countries is obviously something that has kind of defined development economics for as long as there's been development economics. And it's easy, and I think in some sense, one could argue that the macro literature has gotten really focused on identifying frictions and trying to think about how a particular friction can play out in terms of having big productivity impacts. There's this competing theme coming out of the development literature, your work among others, really starting in the hesitates to say the 80s and 90s, but this, the competing viewpoint, which really looks at how well informal institutions and informal arrangements in rural economies in developing countries are able to overcome a lot of these market failures and frictions. sometimes in very creative ways, and sometimes with structures that don't really have parallels in rich countries. How should we think about the effectiveness of these informal institutions in addressing problems of market failure and market imperfection?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so as economists, we're used to thinking about interconnections between activities. Now, a friction or an imperfection in one market or along one margin has consequences for actions and behavior along another. And so imperfect insurance is associated with changes in savings behavior as people build up buffer stocks. And so similar interconnections arise with institutions. Imperfect insurance can be associated with changes in like credit market rules to integrate insurance into the credit market. This is not necessarily a causal linkage. It's not necessarily because of imperfect insurance you got changes in the structure of credit markets. I don't think that simple functionalism was always the right way of explaining institutions. For example, I think that an institution like a chief farmer, Sarki Noma, it influences how learning takes place when there's learning externalities and how experimentation takes place, but I don't think it's a cause of that institution. But understanding those connections, I think, is really important. And I think this matters a lot in stuff we've been talking about today. Let's take land markets, for example. I think this is a really important context for thinking about these sort of sometimes surprising or hidden interconnections. I am fully on board with, I've written about it, and totally agree with the idea that complex land markets like we see in much of Africa with ill-defined ownership rights, complicated rules for who gets to make decisions about particular bits of land. These are associated with really strong frictions, and when coupled with things like labor market imperfections, lead to huge amounts of misallocation. But I think there's other layers to the story that we have to keep in mind when we think about what's going on. Let me just give it, since this isn't a paper and this is sort of a discussion, let me just give a personal example. When I was first working in Ghana in the early 1980s, it was in terrible shape. Everything that could go wrong with import substituting industrialization went wrong. And the economy was in complete economic collapse, to the extent that somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population had left Ghana and was living in Nigeria to try to make ends meet. And then things got worse. There was drought, there were apocalyptic bushfires. Oregon meets Venezuela in a poorer environment. It was just awful. And then in early 1983, Nigeria was also facing some trouble. So they expelled about 1 million Ghanaians with a week or so's notice. So there's 1 million Ghanaians walking from Nigeria back to Ghana in the context of bushfires and collapsing economy. And everybody thought there was just going to be chaos. Social, political unrest, all these unemployed guys would be flooding the cities, there'd be riots. And there was already a military government. It slipped really bad. And it never happened. It just, these 1 million refugees, most of them went back to their hometowns. They got given land, they started farming. It was still a disaster, but it wasn't apocalyptic. There was enormous social stability that was maintained. And this is clearly a consequence of these same bizarre, complicated political land tenure arrangements that existed in rural areas. These land tenure arrangements are the source of chiefs' power. There's great work on how chiefs manipulate their power over land to maintain their political control and to extract resources from people. But at the same time, they have an obligation to deal with crises. And there's no landless class in most anywhere in West Africa because of these rules. And these kind of complex political rules that are associated with lots of economic inefficiencies and imperfect incentives to invest and misallocations also provide a resilience and a flexibility that one wouldn't imagine exists one wouldn't have thought a priori was what was going on. And so reforms to the land tenure system clearly are required and will be necessary as development progresses. But I think it's really important for us to be thinking about these other hidden interconnections that may be in the background that we don't think about when we're thinking about the wedges that lead to inefficiencies in the allocation process, but that will make themselves known as large-scale policy to reform these frictions is taken. So, thanks.
Thanks, Chris. That's really interesting. And the image of Oregon meeting Venezuela is one that I'm going to hang on to as a pretty good description of apocalypse. So let me just do another round before I throw things open for questions and sort of thinking in terms of STEG's responsibility in this first year to kind of design and shape and advance a research agenda for subsequent years. Maybe I'll just ask each of you for a second, what do you think are kind of one or more key questions for research that on agriculture and or on sectoral gaps in relation to growth, in relation to structural transformation that you'd like to see the literature tackle over the next, let's say over the next 5 years? Richard, can I toss that one to you?
Sure, I'm gonna say something pretty basic, and it was kind of touched on today that, I mean, first there is, a fair bit of data out there, but it's not really super accessible to everybody. And now I forget who mentioned it today in their comments, but we've got multiple people like re-cleaning. There's like a lot of wasted effort that creates, I think, a barrier to kind of accessing data that is there. So I think to the extent that STEG can actually do something to kind of lower those barriers and make the data that's out there clean and accessible, I think that's going to be hugely valuable to research. But beyond that, I mean, and this is such a cheap comment, but I think I have to say it anyways, there just isn't as much data as we would like. I don't know, I do think part of the STEG mission is to facilitate data collection and dissemination. That's easy thing to say. It's not so easy to actually implement. But when I think of, I talked earlier about agricultural productivity, and you worked on this. I mean, you have the QJE paper with David and Michael, and that's a very important paper. At the same time, I mean, I think you all would agree, it's kind of primitive in terms of just our ability to kind of make some simple corrections for things. And so we just need to know a lot more in order to theorize about what's going on. So I'm hoping that one of the things STEG can do is, with the data that does exist, kind of increase its availability, because I think there are a lot of barriers there. And then second, to the extent possible, create new and better data sources.
Thanks, Richard. I think we would certainly plead guilty to primitive. It's one of the nicer things I could say about my own work at best, but I think that's spot on. And I think we talked the other day, David Lagakos is writing a pathfinding paper for us on microdata needs, and there's a theme on trying to identify and deal with data needs. But I think this is obviously something that STEG needs to push on and to encourage I don't know that we ourselves are going to be in a position to do lots of primary data collection, but I think there's an appetite in the donor community for us to feed back in on questions such as what kinds of data do we need to understand structural transformation processes, and to move away from just looking at things at the household and individual level, and to think about the broader data needs for studying transformation and growth, which may be a little bit different. Maggie, can I take the same question to you? What would you like to see in terms of where we should be pushing on the research frontier?
Do I have to unmute myself? Okay. Geez, Richard, if you called Doug's paper primitive, I hate to know what you say about my paper with Danny Roderick. But so there are two things I think I would love to see STEG push forward. One, my own bias is sort of the sectoral data that the GGDC has is pulling together, and the updated data set. I would love to see more of that divided into, you know, formal and informal activity, or even 3 tiers, the way we're doing in our paper with Ethiopia and Tanzania. You know, large formal, small formal, and informal activities within all of the sectors, because I think we just need to understand a lot more about that, what's going on there. And of course, that links back to all the LSMS ISA data improvements, more information on non-farm enterprises, et cetera. Then the other thing I'm really interested in, and I'm not sure how one would go about this, but I think the political economy aspect of why we're not seeing more rapid formal sector development in a lot of African countries is just critical. And let me just give you Tanzania as an example. The formal sector firms that we've studied in the manufacturing sector, the large ones are growing at, like, value added is growing at 8% per year. That's huge. So why is it that some firms, you know, some big formal firms can do so well? Is it because they have links to the party, they're financing CCM, and they get special breaks? These kinds of things are really hard to uncover, as we all know, but I think they're super important. And, you know, I don't know as much about what's going on in Ethiopia and along those lines, but I suspect it's important.
Thanks. Again, political economy is something we've got on our radar. It's one of our themes, but I think understanding the influence of political economy issues on firm growth is something obviously fairly critical. And I also have to say, second, I think one of the things that's come out of the workshops we've held so far is a kind of recurring sense that the 3 sectors, that the division of the economy into 3 sectors is not the most useful one, that there's just so much blurring across sectors. And then the interesting action is in many cases taking place within sectors. It's about, and so we're just not breaking things up necessarily and disaggregating the most useful ways. Lori, over to you.
Yeah, I guess when you asked me the question the last round about the sectoral gap and migration literature in particular, I think one thing that sort of gnaws at me a little bit in that literature, and I don't know the exact way to push forward, but I wanted to throw out some like vague idea that maybe this group can make some traction on. So we see these large sort of raw sectoral gaps, and then we see that if we move individuals from a rural area to an urban area, we might get these like 20 to 30% increases in income. But there's still that big gap that's remaining. And I think Todd, for example, is on this call. And I you know, in some of his modeling work, I found it useful that he sort of thinks about human capital as like years of education and then something like innate ability. And the way that this sort of like this thinking about selection and sorting is such that like, well, you know, sort of low ability people end up being in the rural areas, and this might be efficient sorting. And I think this is like inherently sort of a dangerous kind of area to settle on. And I think we need to be thinking about, like, nobody really thinks that it's actually like innate ability, right? Nobody thinks that these are just like fixed characteristics. So what is it beyond years of schooling And Doug, in your QJE paper show that even with conditional years of schooling, the literacy difference, there's a literacy difference between rural and urban households. So there's clearly something about quality of schooling, but I suspect that there's a lot more there's something about like growing up in an urban area versus a rural area, which seems to facilitate having a better labor market choice set. And that must be part of the limitation of why, people get stuck in rural areas. And even if they can move from, as sort of Maggie said, they can move from low productivity agriculture to maybe low productivity service work in the city. I think there needs to be more thinking about what are the investments that need to be made in order for that human capital that it's in, for the humans that are in the rural areas to be able to move into better jobs.
Thanks. Chris, I'm just going to hand that directly over to you. Where would you like to see the research go?
So I'll just pile on. It's all about data and measurement. We're so bad at measuring so many of the things that matter to us, from simple things like how many hours somebody's working on their farm, to complicated, subtle things like Lori was talking about. What is this thing that's making urban kids do better and finding jobs? It's sort of boring, but it's getting better measurement of the fundamentals that go into our models: land, labor, output, yield. Even things like rainfall. Mark Rosenzweig and I spent weeks looking at these remarkable divergences between the data we downloaded on rainfall and the data that villages were reporting for rainfall, trying to understand what the hell is going on. So that's number one. And then on policy, again, I'll just pile on and say that understanding migration and formal sector and job growth is clearly something that is what this group can do really well, and what I want to know a lot more about. And of course, I want to know a lot more about institutions, but that's obvious. So that's obvious.
So let me take the opportunity just to open things up and to ask people to, maybe if you post a question in the chat. I don't know who's got access to microphones and who doesn't, but I'm happy to read out the first set of questions, which might be the easiest. So Dietz Volrath has a question. It says, for any or all of the panel, to what extent are the misallocations we talk about from the aggregate output perspective optimal from the perspective of ensuring land access and subsistence? This kind of, I think, fairly directly relates to what you were talking about, Chris. Or more crudely, Dietz says, are people optimizing something different than what we as economists are optimizing? A shocking possibility, I have to say. Chris, do you want to speak to that?
If I can figure out how to unmute it, yes. Yeah, so clearly, it's not so much that I think people are necessarily optimizing something different from what we think they're optimizing, although obviously that's true. But more that when we try to translate our models into policy, we're leaving out big elements of what's going on. And that because of, and we do that not because we want to do that, but because we don't know about some of the implications that aren't in our models of what we're proposing changing. And so that's calling for more reading, more collaboration across disciplines, more talking to people to try to understand and get hints about the unforeseen roles that certain friction, certain institutions, certain behaviors are playing in the economy that we can model, we just aren't because we haven't figured it out yet. Yeah, I think that's where I would start.
I mean, taken to an extreme, you don't want to end up in with the viewpoint that everything's optimal because people must be maximizing something. That would be a sort of slightly depressing view of the world. No?
Right. And so that's why I tried to emphasize that I don't think that institutions operate the way they do because they're serving these functions necessarily. But a more sophisticated view of how institutions evolve is an important research program, and how institutions change. And they don't necessarily change because they're doing so to maximize somebody's something. It's a political process and a sociological process that we need to study in its own right. But even without that, I think we can make progress as economists just by understanding what functions they are serving and incorporating that into our models.
Thanks. Anybody else on the panel feel they want to address that? If not, I have a couple of questions. One that I think Maggie has just answered in the chat window, but Joe, you had a question for Maggie about what's going on really in relation to multinational investment and export. So taking this back to the macro level, do you want to expand on that?
That was just a clarification for the data she was presenting from Vietnam versus Tanzania and Ethiopia. I was curious, I guess she's already answered it in the chat. Yeah. I did want to say one thing about the data, just with my STEG leader hat on, because both Richard and Chris mentioned it, and we are 100% on board. In fact, the data and measurement is theme 0. We oddly started counting with 0 because we thought it underlies kind of everything for the research. But we are in a little bit of an odd situation where we really don't have the funding to fund the data collection. We would love to be able to do that, but we don't. And so we're kind of trying to brainstorm ways of leveraging the resources we do have, maybe thinking about collaborations to try to improve data and measurement without really having the funding to do it ourselves. I mean, we're not a national statistics office or something like that. I was curious whether any of the panelists have feedback on that front, where they have possibly thought about these things, where you think we might be able to make progress.
I can say something about that, but first I want to say although I'm talking possibly in macro terms, my data are firm level data, so I consider it micro data. So the data on manufacturing and exports and FDI and so forth. So, you know, I talked a little bit to Haitzan DeVry about this, but this is just one example, and it's for manufacturing. And I think for services, it's much, 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 much harder. But for example, UNIDO, you know, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, they collect data for several countries on formal sector manufacturing. So that was where our first cut at dividing manufacturing into formal and informal came from. So we could do something with that if you give us a little bit of money.
I think Richard's comment about the amount of data that's available, but not easily usable. And I think there's maybe something here that STEG can do in brokering some of the relationships between micro people and macro people. We often have relatively non-competing uses for data sets. And I think there's a tendency in the micro development world to see data sets as having particular purposes or serving for a particular project, and the aggregation potential across those data sets seldom easy to do tight identification across multiple data sets coming out of different interventions or something. And I think there might be some potential for pulling those together in some way that would make them easier for macro people to use, again, for really quite different purposes in many cases. And I think that's something that Richard is getting at, and maybe something that I think it was Mike Waugh who raised the issue earlier, and I think very much something that we ought to be able to pull together people in this community to do something on. Paco, you had a comment picking up on something that Chris said.
Yeah, I like Chris's comment, and I mean, this is an old theme in economic development about the fact that institutions serve many roles. And my take on that, or maybe to the panel or to STEG in general, is that that's also called for, that has a strong call for richer models. The fact that we oftentimes, for the sake of tractability, we focus on one dimension, and that's a useful thing to do. But what Chris's comments call for is sometimes it may be fundamentally to think of an inherently richer model where you can think about complementary institutions jointly. And that's, I guess, my reading of Chris's comment is not so much about, I mean, not only about data, but also about we need to have generative models that can talk about these different issues. I guess it's not a question per se, but a thought.
Comments are welcome. We don't necessarily have to formulate everything as questions.
I totally agree, and just want to say that, yeah, you guys are the ones to do it. Because you think in terms of general equilibrium. You're already thinking in terms of things interconnected. This is just calling for expanding that. And one other thing to, on data, one thing we could do, many of us are using these LSMS data sets, which the World Bank is producing, which is in the core mission of the World Bank of producing global public goods. And that group is always under pressure. And we can provide intellectual and political support to make sure that their work in improving data quality and making micro data from around the world available is really important. Just reminding leadership folks at the World Bank when you meet them how important this is.
I think the other thing that I raised in the Theme Zero workshop is the openness of that group to working with the community of economists to think about how better to measure things and what they could be measuring differently. There's, I think, a lot of receptiveness and a lot of interest in trying to look at some of the things that our community has struggled with. And so anybody who has ideas or thoughts or input on interesting data experiments, how to measure better profits in household enterprises. I think it's easy for us to say the data is terrible, or it's not doing a good enough job of informing us about time use. We need to be willing to engage and think about how to do those things better.
One of the things I could envision, Chris, you mentioned the World Bank, and yeah, we've been talking with them. I could envision something where STEG provides some funding and STEG researchers provide some expertise in collaboration with larger World Bank funding and maybe national government funding for sort of a demonstration project of a very useful data set. And then if we were able to demonstrate that this was actually quite informative, then maybe that would grow into something that would be more broadly applied. I don't have any details in mind, but that's just kind of like a dream I have.
Anybody else have thoughts on where we should be pushing the research frontier on this theme in particular? I think it's a good moment to raise issues that we should be tackling. And I think there has been a tendency, perhaps because we've gotten focused on sectoral gaps in agricultural productivity, to define things very narrowly in that way. If we were to broaden the conversation a little bit, what are the related themes that we should be pushing on? This is for panelists, but also for anybody else who wants to weigh in here.
Can I speak up? Can you hear me?
You can indeed. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So I want to say a couple things about so first of all, this relates to the trade stuff that's going to happen tomorrow. So there are countries right now in Africa that are negotiating free trade agreements with the United States. And then there's the internal African trade agreement being set up to be able to measure what's going to happen if these trade agreements take place, and how these economies respond or don't respond to the trade agreements could be like a transformative exercise. Because one of the things we just kind of don't know is when there's a trade agreement in a developing country, how's that going to help or not? And I think this is something that, again, it's kind of a data issue, but just like having it aware for researchers to be set up and in place to take advantage of this stuff. The other thing, going back to the original kind of data ideas, is, sharing it. Another idea is education. Is STEG could facilitate some, have some people that have deep knowledge of the LSMS, give some kind of web seminar or something to broaden and educate, like Richard could listen into this thing and see what's going on. And then you could help, or grad students, and help everyone further better understand what's in the data, what's not in the data. And that would be, I think, a relatively low cost way to disseminate information about these data sets more broadly.
I think that's interesting. Your first point, Mike, I think raises a question, and maybe I'll toss this out to the group as well. What are the things that we should be collecting data on today so that people working in this field in 5 or 10 years won't say, gosh, it's a shame they didn't do this back in 2020. And I don't necessarily just mean in terms of identifying the impacts of COVID or something, but sort of broadly speaking, we know we're observing a lot of countries at moments where transformation of various kinds is taking place. We want to understand these processes. What should we be collecting data on now so that our successors in development and growth economics will have the data they need? Nobody's going to bite. It's the end of a long day in Europe, and
I think the climate change stuff is a big topic. We have a pathfinding paper we commissioned on it, but how climate change is going to affect going forward agriculture and structural transformation in the future of developing countries, I think that's first order. But we're supposed to be recipients, so you guys should react to that. Either tell me that I'm full of crap, or
So I was going to say, in response to Michael's idea, I think there's maybe a useful distinction between data that we would need to collect, which then might be expensive and difficult, but there could also be like the data that governments themselves are already collecting. And it's about potentially STEG could, as an institution, can use that to have more agreements with governments that they will release the data going forward. And that kind of piece is something that's difficult for individual researchers to manage to do with multiple countries. And so that kind of like policy engagement could be helpful.
I couldn't agree with that more. Most of my data work has been with national statistical agencies, and I get very frustrated by the fact that, sorry, but I feel that there's a lot of data that we could use, help to make better, that we just go and collect our own data instead of working with the national statistical agencies. So that's a pet peeve of mine. But on the climate change stuff, Joe, I think that's super important. And we have a colleague, Kyle and I, Owen McGurk, who's doing some work with Nathan Nunn on the impact of climate change on conflict in Africa, especially in the Sahel area. And that, I mean, those kind of, I'm not saying you necessarily want to get into conflict work, but I just think the repercussions are enormous of climate change.
Chris, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I agree. I think one thing to think about is what incrementally needs to be captured. And I just totally agree with Maggie that collaboration with government statistical agencies and government administrative agencies, and maybe formal sector firms as well, to make records of an archive as much administrative data as possible is I think something that we could be doing now. Now it's becoming more clear how valuable these sort of administrative data sets can be. Having them lost would be terrible.
Let me toss out to the panel a question from Karen Ortiz in the chat, which is really about the capacity of urban areas to absorb the flows of people who are either now moving or on the verge of moving from rural areas to urban areas. And I think we all understand that this process of urbanization is taking place rapidly. It's in the category of things that we could be collecting data on now. I think we probably do a relatively poor job in general of understanding what's going on in urban economies. The LSMS ISAs have done a great job of giving us lots of detail on what's going on in agriculture. I think we know a lot less about what's happening in informal services, in the bottom half or third of the labor market in cities. And Karen asks, is it not a concern that formal labor markets in urban areas cannot absorb rural workers? What are your thoughts? So that's kind of an analytic question, and then a policy question or a normative question, perhaps. What are your thoughts about promoting better jobs within rural economies, strengthening rural-urban linkages? Let me toss that to you, Lori.
Thanks. No, I mean, I think that's like such a big question. And I know Mushfiq was doing an experiment where he was like trying to have an experiment large enough where you could see if you change like the percentage of migrants that were coming in across different urban areas, like how well the urban areas would be able to absorb those workers. I think that's like a really key question. I mean, from my perspective, I don't know if the distinction between making good jobs in rural areas versus urban areas is necessarily all that important, but I do think the being able to develop better jobs irrespective of where they are is an important policy question, and frankly one that I have no idea how you do that. Maybe somebody else in the panel or in the audience does.
Richard, you've been silent here. I'm going to toss things back to you here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any answers really to this, but I'll just say a couple things. I mean, you know, I started today talking about productivity in agriculture, which I do think is a key question. You know, no country can ever become rich by modern standards if it's got, you know, 2/3 of its people as farmers. There's just that's not going to work out. So, and becoming more productive in agriculture, I think is important in terms of releasing that labor. So that's certainly part of it. But, you know, in some ways, this question points to the fact that logically, a country could be very productive in agriculture and be a complete basket case if it's not good at doing anything else. And so, this issue of what does the economy do with the labor that's not producing food or you know, agriculture more generally? What do they do with that labor? And you know, step one in some ways is to get better at agriculture to release that labor, but then obviously step two, you have to actually use that labor productively. And that's obviously kind of another key part of the development process, and what's preventing that from happening. And some of what Maggie was showing before, just in terms of, you know, what's going on in countries where there's, you know, our models tell us if there's a whole bunch of workers with very poor options in urban areas, this should be good for people to start businesses to hire those workers. Yet that's not happening. And, you know, there's just, even the more one digs, the more puzzles one kind of finds. You've got all these, you know, there's no formal sector workers, but there should be this huge desire to hire the cheap labor in formal firms that can benefit from cheap, large labor forces. But then even the people that are starting small firms, why don't they hire some of these workers? I mean, there's just, it just seems that one finds puzzles as one looks. The other thing I would say, you know, just as a random thought, I mean, I've been trying to fill in some of my massive gaps in knowledge, reading about the Industrial Revolution. And, you know, when you hear what I read as the workers that were released from agriculture in Britain it's not like they had some great time that they found these wonderful jobs. I mean, everything I read says, you know, they were kind of thrown out of the land because nobody needed them anymore, and they were kind of destitute, and they took these horrible jobs in factories. And so there's a lot of, the development process has a lot of pain and suffering associated with it. So in our models, we might think, oh, development, you become more productive and everybody has these, you know, everything's good for everybody. It isn't always good for everybody, it seems. But anyways, that's not an answer to the question. It's just some random thoughts.
So let me ask this question. You said, Richard, and I think it's right, that we can't envision countries getting rich with 2/3 of the population in agriculture. Is the issue agriculture, or is the issue 2/3 of the population in subsistence and quasi-subsistence? Is it just that Adam Smith had this right, and that this is about specialization, division of labor, kind of really fundamental, that the problem is when you have 2/3 of the people who are home producing many of their goods. So should we be thinking really about, this is a question that Joe asked me the other day, should we be thinking about agriculture so much, or should we be asking questions about why so many people are in subsistence? And conditional on them being in subsistence, the thing they're going to do is primarily agriculture, because that's the fundamental need.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start first, and then other people can obviously chime in. I think so. I agree. The narrower statement is a country will never get rich with 2/3 of the people in subsistence agriculture. I mean, no individual will get rich doing subsistence agriculture. My more general statement, what I had in mind is, you know, maybe a little bit naive, but I think it's kind of true, is there's not enough land in most countries for 2/3 of the population to have the income of farmers in the United States. So there's a constraint on the land that would be necessary to support that. But if you had enough land to kind of, you know, do at scale what happens in the United States, I mean, you can say, well, you know, Nebraska or Iowa, where there's lots of farmers, can't we just replicate that? Well, you actually run out of land if you try and replicate that. So that's what I had in mind.
Anyone else want to bite on this? Chris?
That's an interesting way of thinking about it. I agree that the long-run process of development obviously involves people getting out of agriculture. But Richard, you're right. It's not necessarily because it's agriculture. It's because you can't have highly productive agriculture in West Africa with the population distribution across the land as it is. And so it's about factors of production and specialization and division of labor together, right?
So that may be a point. I'm sensing not a ton of residual energy here, but that might be a nice segue into tomorrow's session on spatial frictions. I'm noticing that there's some really good and thoughtful comments in the chat window on data, including Dietz posting stuff that I can't open while I'm talking to you all about time use data. I think the time use data is something that many of us have been interested in and have been talking about for a while. Really trying to understand, in particular, time use in home production, gendered patterns of time use. So I think lots of issues that we can push on, and I think the data agenda is something we're hearing across the themes. So definitely STEG is going to try to push these as best we can. But as Joe says, we may not be super well positioned to do it. Unless there are other burning questions, I'm thinking we've gone a little bit over time. Joe, I should probably turn things over to you for a second. Do you have anything you want to add? And then I'll give it back to Julieta or Kevin if they want to close out. Joe?
Oh, I just wanted to say, I think all the idea of STEG kind of playing a role as a public good for making existing data more accessible is probably something that's the most feasible that we could and should pursue. So.
Kevin or Julieta, do you have anything to add?
Not really. I think this was a wonderful day of discussion. The panel really touched on a bunch of pressing issues that are going to come up. And this idea of public provision and community building, and the idea of trying to bring, new people, the younger generation in, should be priority for STEG. So thank you everybody for participating today. We hope you enjoyed the discussion.